One is that tradition and individual talent are equally important. But as far as the English tradition of literature is concerned, there has been a disproportionate attention on the poet's personality. Poetry has been interpreted in relation to the personality and the personal experiences of the writer. According to Eliot, this appears to be a deficiency in the English system of criticism. Then he affirms the importance of tradition in the process of writing poetry. Every good poet should acquire a sense of tradition, which means he should have a sound knowledge of all the established conventions of literature, which have been established in poetry through various ages during which poetry has been uh, written. After this, he went on to say that tradition cannot be equated with history. Tradition is related more with the aesthetic understanding of poetry through various ages during which poetry has been written. And it is not simply a mechanical memorization of the poems and the poets who have produced works in the past. This can be related, as I said earlier, with a simple thing that right from the beginning of life, fact and fiction have been different. T.S. Eliot maintains that the distinction between fact and fiction is very important. Poetry is definitely not factual. It is a part of fiction. It is a part of creativity. Therefore, the knowledge of tradition is actually the understanding of the aesthetics, the aesthetic conventions, the aesthetic methods, genres which have been used. It is very important to acquire these in order to become a poet. Okay? Poetry is not something that flows out of a man's experiences, a man's personality. Okay? Tradition is also important. You need to have a good understanding of the methods, of the honors, of the conventions which have evolved over time. Poetry, just like, as I have just to repeat myself, like other aspects of cultural experience, is a collective response to the existence of man on this earth. Okay? It is not something entirely individual. Okay? To put it in a better way, we should say that individual experiences as well as the knowledge of traditions, they are equally important when poetry is written. Thereafter, T.S. Eliot argued that uh, tradition should not be treated as a lump or a bolus, by which he means that tradition is dynamic, it is not static. And the last point that we made was that past and present affect each other in a two-way process, not a one-way process. Every new piece of poetry changes our conception and our perception of poetry to a great extent. Every novel work, every novel piece of writing, every new piece of literature has an equal potential of altering the past as the past has the potential of determining the present. So these were, in a nutshell, the points that we discussed till today. Today, as I said, we will be taking up section 2, in which he develops his ideas related to the theory of depersonalization. See, there is a very clear distinction between a personal approach to poetry and an impersonal approach to poetry. T.S. Eliot's ideas are marked by a very practical, objective approach to poetry and not a subjective approach to poetry. This is, I think, an attribute which is linked with his status as a modern poet. Okay? Somebody who was writing during the times when modernity was being introduced in arts and there was a reformulation of ideas, okay, related to poetry. So he marks a very important turning point in the field of poetry. So here, just to strengthen his case, just to strengthen his argument that poetry should have more objectivity. Okay? It is something which is linked with depersonalization. He decides to elaborate his ideas with the help of an analogy from chemistry, okay, where he says that I shall therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action that takes place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. So see, there is a link between the method he uses to explain his point and his point. Okay? The point is that there should be objectivity in writings, that it is an impersonal process. Okay? Depersonalization is very important when we write poetry, and he decides to. Okay? So there is a correspondence between the method and his point. Okay? He decides to illustrate his point with the help of a chemical experiment where oxygen and sulfur dioxide react in the presence of a filament of platinum. Okay? Platinum here is a catalyst, and he will explain the function of a poet with the help of this experiment. Honest and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. So he begins his point by making a very, very important assertion. The assertion is that there is need to turn our attention away from the poet and towards poetry. Okay, so he begins with this. He says that generally in all criticism, okay, and in all forms of analysis of poetry, there is a very strong tendency to uh, to valorize poets, okay, to attach very great value to the reputation of various poets. So the quality of the poetry is more dependent on the reputation of a poet rather than being the other way round, rather than reputations being built because the poetry is good. So he has an objection to this. So, and his entire endeavor is to revise the notion, the concept of poetry, okay, on these lines. Okay. So let me read another very important line from the text. Uh, in the last article, I tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. So here there is a reiteration, okay, of an earlier point that every poem that has been written right from the beginning, when poetry began to be written, constitutes a whole. It is a whole. Okay? We cannot adopt a selective approach to poetry. Okay? It is every piece of poetry is part of the continuous process of creativity, which has shaped literature, which has given definite contours to what we call poetry. So from this, we receive a suggestion that poetry or the evolution of poetry is not the work of individuals. It is the work of all the people put together who have indulged in creativity in one way or the other. Then he says that I hinted at, and I hinted by an analogy that the mind of a mature poet uh, differs from that of the immature one, okay, in the fact that an immature poet is a source, whereas a mature poet is a medium. So T.S. Eliot himself wrote as a medium, not as a source. Just to give you an example, he says a bad poet is a treats himself, looks at himself as the source of poetry, whereas a good poet looks at himself as a medium of poetry. Okay? And then he further elaborates what he means by this distinction between the medium and the source through the analogy we have just referred to. That analogy was that of the catalyst. When the two gases previously mentioned are mixed, that means when oxygen and sulfur dioxide react with each other, uh, in the presence of a filament of platinum, they form sulfurous acid. So this is the chemical reaction, okay, through the help of which he wants to develop his concept of depersonalization. He says when sulfur dioxide and oxygen react with each other in the presence of platinum, sulfurous acid is produced. The combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum. So there are two things which happen. Sulfurous acid is produced when sulfur dioxide and oxygen react with each other. Sulfurous acid is produced only when the reaction takes place in the presence of a filament of platinum. But more importantly, the platinum itself leaves no trace of itself in sulfurous acid. There is no trace of platinum. It does not affect the, the outcome, okay, of the reaction, okay, which remains, the outcome remains inert, neutral, and unchanged. The transposition of these ideas to poetry would definitely lead to an understanding that based on this, we have to treat the poet as a medium, not as a source. Okay? And a good poet is one, okay, who does not allow too much of his personality, his subjectivity, his personal experiences overshadow the works he produces. Okay? Uh, and this is beautifully described here in the line. The more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. So there are two key terms. One, poet is a medium. Second, he is a instrument of transmutation, not an instrument of creation. Okay? So, in that sense, a poet is not a gifted person. A poet is not unique in his capacity as a writer of poems. Okay? He is not somebody extraordinary. Okay? He is only someone who registers the experiences of life, okay, which present themselves to him in the form of emotions and feelings, which are abstract. And these emotions and feelings are given the shape of words and images, okay, uh, in various combinations by the poet. This is his work. Okay? This precisely is his work. The experience, you will notice uh, the elements which enter the presence of transforming catalyst are of two kinds, emotions and feelings. If we, as I said, transpose these ideas in poetry, we will say that just as uh, sulfur dioxide and oxygen react with each other, similarly, uh, the emotions and feelings, they are the raw material with which or which react or which combine in various uh, combinations, okay, in the mind of the poet is the catalyst. So uh, his work is, as I said, to to take feelings and emotions as his raw material, which are abstract. Okay? Feelings and emotions are abstract, and it is the work of the poet to transmute these feelings and emotions and give them a concrete shape in the form of images and words. Okay? But this is easier said than done because it is not a mechanical process. Okay? It is not a mechanical process. A lot of tradition, knowledge of tradition, is required to actuate this process. Okay? Because one does not become a poet if we follow his ideas and his logic. We can say that one does not become a poet by birth. It is through the reading of poetry, through learning how these activities, the creative process takes place. So the poet's mind is in fact a receptacle which can unite to form a new compound. Sorry, I am repeating. The poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles can unite to form a new compound are present together. So it is not simply a very mechanical, okay, process of combining feelings and emotions and giving them there is some uh, something more to it also. So he says the poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing of numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound. So definitely some serendipity is also important. Okay? He is not rejecting the idea that a poet is, after all, a talented person. Okay? So there is some individuality, some training in tradition, some serendipity, some understanding that the poet is not a source but a medium, which would make one a good poet. So poet's main job is finding appropriate images for feelings and the right combinations in which feelings and images, okay, can be mixed and blended to produce poems. Okay? So these ideas are then, there in his notion of objective correlative also, which I suggest all of you must read about in your glossaries of literary terms. Okay? And then in the next part, because I have just suggested that for him, poet is not a genius, we should simply say. Okay? So he rejects the idea of the sublime, either in poetry or in connection with our perspective about the poet. So, if you compare several representative passages of the greatest poetry, you see how great is the variety of types of combinations, and also how completely and semi-ethical, any semi-ethical criterion of sublimity misses the mark. For it is not greatness, it is not the greatness of the person but the intensity of the process which is important. Okay? The intensity of the process of writing, not a pre-existing a priori greatness of the person who is the poet. Okay? It is the more intense the process of writing, the better. The more intensity you put into the perception of ideas, the perception of feelings and emotions, and then searching for images, searching for the appropriate words to mix them in the most effective way. That is what, for him, constitutes poetry. So, finally, uh, somewhere in the middle of this section, the difference between art and the event is always absolute. You cannot simply create overlaps of personal experience and poetry. Okay? That is disapproved of here. So there is difference between art and the event is always absolute. The combination, which is the murder of Agamemnon, is probably as complex as that which is the voyage of Ulysses. And then he elaborates this with the help of a poem which all of us have read. In either case, there has been a fusion of elements. The Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale. Ode to the Nightingale is a poem in which so many things felt by the poet about life, about death, about the transience of life, okay, about so many insecurities that plague the mind of a man. They are all expressed through one symbol. The symbol is the nightingale. Which the nightingale, I am repeating this line again. The Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale partly, perhaps because of its attractive name, because of its associations, and partly because of its reputation, serve to bring together. So we will be concluding in the next lecture.